Moin Moin. Thanks for showing up to my talk, Fairy Tale Time in Hybrid App Development. I tried to explain my son this morning what I'm doing today. I told him I'm going to a cinema and I'm going to talk in the cinema, and he kind of didn't understand. So I promised to take a selfie in the cinema while talking to show him what I'm doing here. So if you can help me with that and just put the thumb out like that if you really like the talk, and I will do a picture at the same time. Yeah. So I need to see the thumbs, otherwise then I might be able to show to my son and to my boss. Thanks. Okay, yeah, let's see what this talk brings. My name is Peter Grauvogel. I work as a front-end hero, architect, or developer. Depends a bit on who is asking. If it's about salary, I'm an architect. If it's about what I love doing, it's developer. If I have to save the release for the PO, it's front-end hero. And I work as a company called SDA, just around the corner at the Reeperbahn. And what we basically do is we provide a platform for insurances. Sounds very boring, but basically this platform enables people like us to do proper development with the data insurances have. So basically our goal is to provide meaningful services on this platform. And one of the services we provide started as a POC to show what the platform can do. It's called the Customer App or Kunden App in German. And basically it showcases all the different services we have. And since customers liked it a lot, we are now shipping it as part of our product portfolio. And today I want to talk a bit about how that journey was, what we did wrong, what we maybe did right, and what our learnings were. I know there's a Q&A session at the end, but feel free to ask questions in between if you feel like it. Otherwise, I tend to forget the questions. If answering them takes too long, we can push them to the end. But I think we should be okay from a timing perspective. So I thought about, like this journey, the last 2.5 years, it was kind of like a fairy tale. So I thought, what fairy tale could it be? Do you have any suggestions what a good fairy tale could be? You can also name it in German if you don't know the English name. No ideas? Too long ago? No kids? Okay. I chose the Little Red Riding Hood, which is Rotkäppchen in German. And when I found out what it is in English, that was like the #1 reason why I almost decided to do this talk in German, because it's kind of a Zungenbrecher. So let's see how that goes. Yes, so that will be our fairy tale for today. And let's start with Once Upon a Time and read what happened once upon a time. Anyone who doesn't know that fairy tale? You should ask positive questions. So who knows that fairy tale? Okay, works better. So how did it start for us? About 2.5 years ago, there was this idea of building this app. And it was kind of a bunch of developers and management who sat together. And they thought, okay, we want to build this app. And at the same time, we want to launch this new web portal. And if we can use the same code, that's quite handy. So let's do hybrid development. And then they stumbled across Ionic, and they, fast, beautiful apps, lightning fast developers. It's cheap to get web developers, management thought. So they started off with Ionic web development. At the beginning, everything was good, just like as in a fairy tale. To give you a bit of a background, just one slide about our development and dev setup. So basically, we're using Ionic with Angular now in version 3. We just upgraded from 3 to 4, so Ionic 4 with Angular 8, and using Cordova for the native features. And most people like IntelliJ. And then we have a couple of repositories at GitHub. We'll talk more about that later. We are doing continuous builds on Jenkins and on Bitrise, actually. So we're using Jenkins for the web builds and the unit tests, and are building the native apps on Bitrise. Anyone else using Bitrise here for CI environment? Okay, not that many. Any other cloud providers for native builds that you're using? Okay, are you doing it on your own, like hosting it yourself, having a Mac Mini in the store? Okay, and then we're deploying to the app stores. So the very beginning was very simple. What do you need? You have a customer for the insurance. Basically, what they need to do is they need to log in. They might want to view their contracts. That alone is already a challenge for insurances, right? Getting all the data from the different contracts together and viewing them in one UI. So if you look at most insurance companies, they are usually a merger of 1, 2, 3, or 4 insurances. So you have like Signal Iduna, you have Alte Leipziger Hallische, you have Hook Coburg. So all of them are pretty much joint ventures between different companies, and that's how they behave, right? So it's one company, but if you're unlucky, different IT, it's at least silos. So it's quite hard for them to agree on a common pattern for the data. And then you had the opportunity to view all the details, to see who you are insuring, how much it costs, and maybe kind of what are the benefits you get from it. So that was the very beginning. And then Little Red Riding Hood gets on its way. The key takeaway here is don't leave the way, right? And resist from looking around in all the corners. So what did we do? We started off with like one customer, everything was good, and then business went well, and we got a second customer, and we wanted to have one area of code, and then deploy it to multiple customers in different colors, basically with different features and different settings. So we thought a smart idea would be we just create a repository for each of our customers that contains the configuration for that specific customer. Advantage was we could just basically hand over the repository, dev team over there could put in their variables, whatever they wanted, send it back to us or push it again, and you could just build the app in a very flexible manner. That went well, but then we went off and met the wolf. The thing to notice here is that we didn't know how the wolf looks like. And if you meet a wolf and you don't know what a wolf is, you don't see the danger that you're going to tap in. So what did we do? Besides viewing contracts, which is quite boring for the end user, we added more functionality in the health sector. So basically two things. The first one is that if you are insured privately for health insurance, you have to submit your invoices. So you can do that via snail mail, or you can do it with an app. So we integrated features where you can upload the invoice, would be submitted to the backend of the insurance, and you would get like the status of your submissions. And the second thing we implemented was the possibility, if you get like more than, I think, 2 or 3 medications from your doctor, they give you like a plan with a QR code on it. So you could scan the QR code and it would then display notifications each time you have to take a medicine. Or you could scan your vaccination pass and take it with you when you go on vacation, stuff like that. And because that's all very sensitive data, and we didn't really want to put that into the web part of the app, in the JavaScript part, we purchased like an SDK that would do all the encryption for us. So we just had to write the UI. That's what we thought. But yeah, let's see what happened. The thing was that the SDK was written for Android and for iOS, right? And when you do that, usually you have 2 teams. One is doing Android, one is doing iOS. And what we tried to do essentially was putting these 2 different SDKs that had on the feature level the same features into one code base again, right? So the whole advantage of hybrid app development is that you have one code base, one method, and it does it all. So it's kind of a challenge if you get an SDK that basically does the same thing but has different features. For example, they have a synchronization feature where you can sync across multiple devices. And the way they did that on Android and iOS is very different. So we ended up trying to write this abstraction layer in the Cordova plugin that would get all of that together and make it like seem that one method basically to the front end. And while you can do that, it's a lot of effort to do, and it's also a lot of effort to understand how the different teams implement that SDK. The next question you have to ask yourself is, where do you the whole error handling, or where do you hold state, right? So you have the SDK, which is kind of a black box for you. You have your web front end where you don't really maybe know what the SDK is doing, and then you have this Cordova wrapper in between, which you want to have as less code as possible. But what we did is we started holding state in the Cordova wrapper. And that proved to be quite unlucky because you always need a native developer to do that. You need then at least 2 native developers, one for Android and for iOS. And then you need to sit together with 3 developers because you need the web developer as well to get that feature implemented or to find the bug. It also means that your development lifecycle gets quite complicated because you probably write your front end in TypeScript, you compile that, then you can debug the native part in Xcode, for example. But if you find out, okay, the bug is probably more in the TypeScript part, you can't just update that, but you need to go back and compile it again. So it kind of, you lose the advantages of both worlds there. That went on for a while, and then we got eaten by the wolf. The way projects work, right? Management wants features. There are contracts out there. If you talk with insurance companies, they're usually fixed price, fixed deadline, and all that. And while we tried to work in our little world in an agile manner, at the end of the day, there was this contract. So with the setup we chose, developing features got more complicated. Management got more nervous about their deadlines. There was more pressure to develop faster. Code quality was going down. Development was complicated. It took longer again, and all of that. And I think the main problem was that now we had neither the advantages of a web app or of a native app, right? We were kind of cut in both worlds. It also turned out that like viewing the contract part and maybe changing your personal detail was like now, I don't know, 30% of the actions you were able to do in the app. And then the other 70% were in this native SDK. So you kind of have to ask yourself, why are we actually doing web development if most of the features require a native part to it? The other part was that it sounds all good at the very beginning. You start with web development, and maybe then you want to know the location of the user. You can, you don't even need a Cordova plugin for that. But then you want to have notification, and then you need a Firebase Cordova plugin, and and you add that to the package JSON. Everything is good, and after 2 months, you end up with like 20 to 30 Cordova plugins. So the amount of dependencies you get yourself into increases quite quickly, I think. At the beginning, you have like maybe 1, but then it just stacks up very fast. The other thing we did, that was from the development perspective, on the setup side, we also kind of hindered ourselves to do efficient development because we didn't only have now the config repositories, but we thought, okay, we want to keep our app very modularized and make sure we control the dependencies between the different elements. So we had something what we called UI plugin, for example, for the health part or for the invoices, and we put that into a separate repository as well. And then we had this sophisticated build process that would build everything together. And in addition, we had like the Cordova plugins as well, because we kept them in their own repository as well. And on paper, that looked all very good. But it meant that at one day, we ended up with 33 repositories just belonging to the front-end part of the app. So now you can imagine that you want to implement a new feature, let's say, I don't know, different new status for the invoice submission, which basically means that you probably need to change something in the Cordova plugin because you need to make sure you can receive the new status. You need to do something in the UI plugin to display that in the UI. You probably need to do something in the config repository to make sure that you turn that feature on or off for certain customers. And finally, you probably have something in the core app. So basically, that means that you will get a PR that stretches across, I don't know, 5 or 6 repositories. And that's quite cumbersome to develop. And then we had the sophisticated build script that would check out the feature branches from all the different repositories and build it together in a magical way. And that just adds complexity in so many layers that, you just, I don't know, you didn't want to develop new features because you had to touch so many repositories. And then one day, problems got so big, delay was so big, costs were just increasing so much that we sat together and said, okay, this is not how we can continue. What do we do? And that's when the hunter finds the wolf. The bad thing at that point of time was that the app was already live out there. So we already had customers on that app. So it was not an option to say, okay, we just throw everything away, take another year and start all over again. We did consider a couple of different options though. The first alternative we thought about was just switching the framework, saying, okay, maybe Ionic with Angular wasn't the right choice. We also had, maybe switch to something like React Native, although I think that wouldn't quite solve the problems, or maybe something like Flutter. The second alternative was to say, okay, let's switch to native development, let's go straight iOS and Android. And the third alternative was, okay, we stay with Ionic and Cordova, but we do things differently. Switching the framework, we really considered that. At that time, we also had a second project that was running on React Native, was a separate app, so they were able to do their own technology choice of technology. I think the core point about that is that if you go for something like React Native, you might get better performance than with the web view, but it wouldn't solve really the problem that most of our features at that point of time were in the native part of the app. So we would have had a different framework, different implementation, but I think this whole problem around how do you develop and parts of the native SDK have to be viewed in the UI, you still would have that problem. You might have a better chance using something like Flutter, where I think the integration between native development and what you do in the Dart part is a bit better. But at that point of time, when we did the decision, Flutter was really, quite new to the table. So not something we considered that seriously. The second alternative, going to native iOS and Android development, basically had two big problems for us. The first one was that we had to throw away a lot of the code we wrote, basically all the TypeScript code we had to throw away, although that wouldn't be too bad because most of the features were implemented in a native way. But then we also would lose the option that management liked so much to publish it as a web portal one day. We didn't do that until today, and I'm not sure if it will ever happen, but that was like the reason why we need to stay there. So we said, okay, might be painful, but what can we do about our current setup to improve things? I found this tweet a couple of days ago, and I just had to find a place in the presentation because I liked it so much. I'm not sure if that's the right place, but... The first thing we did is we said, okay, what's easy to do or easier than changing your code is usually changing the setup. Usually, I think what I've seen on setups that don't work quite well is that they have grown over time. So if you take a fresh look at stuff like that, it's usually not that hard to change. So we started looking into the monorepo concept a bit. If you start reading about that, you will have a lot of different opinions. Who's actually working with a monorepository? Oh, not that many people. Are you working with a monorepository that really contains front-end and back-end, or? Yeah. So if you start reading about that, you usually find Google as like the biggest example where they have like the whole code in one repository. And then you find the second article that says, okay, that is pretty much crap, because what people at Google do then is they have a monorepository, but because it's so big, they don't check out the whole repository anymore, but just parts of it. So you can argue that you then lose parts of the positive things about a monorepository. For us, basically, the finding was that we need to have maybe our own definition of a monorepository. So in the first step, we pretty much only merged all the front-end Cordova stuff into that repository. So that's not a monorepository in the pure sense, but it helped us a lot. We wanted to merge also the middleware into that repository, but didn't do that till today because the problems were just not big enough to do that. So what we basically did, we put all the 33 repositories into one repository. And while that sounds a bit crazy at the beginning, we are quite happy with that. First thing is you have now one PR that contains all the changes. It's easily testable. It's easy for other people to spot what's happening in the repository. And now that we have all the teams working in one repository, people get to know better what other teams are doing. It's easier to do cross-team PRs. Yes, it's easier to keep the version to make sure you deploy everything together, that it works. So our experience has been quite positive. And we actually did introduce some dependencies between the different plugins by accident once, which we didn't notice until a couple of weeks later. So yes, it can happen more easily. But in general, we are quite happy, and it just made development a lot quicker. Yeah. While the process of turning all your 33 repositories into one repository is not that simple, actually. I'm not sure if anyone tried that before. If you kind of want to keep your Git history, it's kind of a challenge. You find a lot of articles and tooling out there, but each tooling has like 3 downsides what they don't do. So either you lose your commits in terms of the hashes, or you lose your whole history, or you use the branches, or you lose the tags. So it's like at the end we ended up combining 2 or 3 scripts to really achieve that. The next thing we said, right, we are there. We can't really change what we did from a code perspective at that point of time, but let's be more cautious about new features. So the next thing we wanted to do was delivering documents to the end user. So legally compliant document delivery, because what happens today if you call your insurance, you probably have to call them. You can try writing an email, but not sure if they will reply. They will say, okay, yeah, we change your contract. And then they send you like these 10 sheets of paper with all the documentation about your contract again, just because they changed one little number. Or you tell them, I changed my address. What will they do? They will print a letter and send it to you. Wasting paper, wasting time, wasting money, and also pretty expensive for the insurance. So the idea was we submit or we deliver the documents in the app. We ensure that the insurance can prove that you actually read it, because they have to, for some documents at least, they have to make sure that you read it. If they send it via snail mail, that's equally. But if you are in the digital age, it's more complicated. So, and there we had again the option to say, okay, there's this native SDK, it handles encryption for us, it will talk to the backend of the insurance, and it's already approved by legal, so we could just use it and write our own API UI for it. Or the other option was, okay, we design a system that is more like a standard server REST API. We have to invest more work into the setup of the system, but at the end of the day, it's much easier from a development perspective. So it's quite easy, I guess, to know what we decided to do. And it turned out to be the right decision. The UI development gets so much simpler that actually in this project, the main effort was in the back end. But the effort at the end was not higher than if we would have used the already existing SDK. So writing this UI, which you can see is from a UI perspective quite simple, really was like developing a web app and not like you have to care about all the native stuff. So that proved to be the right decision. The third step we want to do is, at the same time we said, okay, we have a lot of microservices, in the backend it's all microservice or almost all microservices. But in the front end we have this monolith. Although we had this 33 repositories, at the end of the day, all of these repositories only worked together with each other. So you needed the customer module to work with the login, and you needed the login. You can imagine how that works. So we said, okay, we have this microservice architecture in the back end. We don't have it in the front end. So the idea was really to say, for example, for a team like the document team, to say, oh, you're writing the back end, you're writing the middleware, and you can also write the front end, and then you just hook in the front end to the app. The other requirement we had, or we wanted to have, was that we have 2 modi of selling our app and platform. One is we host everything in the cloud. We run it for the insurance, including the app. The other one is you can buy the source code from us, deploy it in your own environment, wherever you want, and you can actually also write extensions for the app. So the only way we said we can do that is we find a modularization with like micro frontends. And if you start reading about micro frontends, is mostly the most common example are shops, right? You have this Rewe shop thingy where they say one micro frontend is the basket, the other one is the search, the third one is the product listing, the fourth one is the listing and all that. You don't get a lot of articles when you talk about apps and micro frontends. There's actually a very interesting talk about micro frontends just now in the other cinema, which I wanted to go to, but they scheduled it at the same time. So what we wanted to do is we wanted a flexible combination of all the elements. So customer A wants that, customer B wants that. We wanted to structure that in a flexible way. We also wanted third-party developers to write new modules for our app, and we wanted to give the possibility to extend existing possibility. The other downside of a monorepository is that for the core development team, it's great because they have this big setup and everything is working well. If you talk to third-party developers that might want to start developing something for your app, downloading this monorepository with the complicated build script is probably quite cumbersome. So we said we want to have like a shell project that you can download, where you basically have a couple of lines of code that contain the minimal amount of packages you need for our app, and then you can just start coding on your own with this very light setup. Like we have this, I don't know how many people have that, but we have this custom build script that I think will never vanish, especially due to the fact that we want to have the one code base and deploy it basically in different versions for different customers. But that's a very, very specific requirement for us. For other developers who want to add a certain functionality, like, for example, this document service, they don't need to care about this whole white label approach and how we push the app, right? They just have in mind to provide the functionality. Oh, there's nachos. So what do? We said, okay, we do modularization basically on this tile perspective, where we say, okay, a tile can be a module. That's easy, right? The next thing, a requirement we had, is to say, okay, there are certain or different kind of contracts, and different kind of contracts can have different sorts of contract details, as an example. And then insurance make it complicated, because they say, okay, you are the owner of the insurance, and you are allowed to see what it costs. And then you have your child insured in that insurance, but your child is supposed to see what is covered, but it's not supposed to see what you pay for it, right? And then it gets more difficult. And when you look at that for other insurances types, it gets more complicated, and then they have other rules. So we say we're going to provide a standard set of rules on how this works. And if you want to implement the logic of your insurance, then we will provide plug points of how you can do that, or at least templates. If you look at micro front ends, there are a couple of architecture goals that you might want to achieve. The first one is isolation. I'm not sure if you started early in the web development where you could just ruin the whole site with one CSS statement. That's something you really probably want to avoid. The other one is separate deployment, also having the possibility to just deploy as a team and not as a whole thing. Then you have single page shell, where the idea is that you might have different SPA frameworks, for example, but you have one tooling that handles that all. Yeah, I stole actually that slide. It's mentioned on the bottom from Manfred Steyer. It's a good read, that article actually, because it explains the different goals and how they could benefit in your development process. The other one is, one goal you could have is using different SPA frameworks in one application. Is anyone doing that? Yeah, I see one. Yeah, that's quite challenging, I think, but quite interesting also in our environment, where we, for example, had one team working with React and the other one with Angular. The other topic you need to talk about then is vendor bundles. How often do you load the vendor bundles? Can you load them only once or multiple times? The other question is, do you want to display several microfrontends at the same time, or are these actually different pages? And the last one is preventing versioning conflicts, right? How do you ensure that if you do separate deployment, that everything you deploy still works together at the end of the day? So for us, what's not that interesting is isolation, separate deployment, and vendor bundles. We all like that, but at the end of the day, we are deploying an app that we have to submit to Apple and to Google. So at the end of the day, we always have to package one package and deploy it at once, right? You could do like dynamic loading if you load certain parts from the web instead of deploying them with the app. But we are not doing that really at the moment. So we said, okay, this is not our focus. The next one was, okay, around single page shell. That's a nice concept if it wraps for you the whole different SPAs. But it's again another dependency, and we are it costs a lot of effort upgrading from Ionic 3 to 4 because they changed a lot. So we didn't want to introduce another dependency. So we said what's really key for us is the possibility to use different SPA frameworks in the future. So to say we have one team working with Angular, one with React, or whatever is up there. We also wanted to display, of course, several micro frontends at the same time. And we wanted to prevent versioning conflicts because that will kill you. And how to achieve that? There are a couple of different architectures you can do. The good old iframe is still around. I've actually seen that people use that, and it can look quite good, but for us, that was not really an option, I guess. The monorepository I already talked about a bit. I would definitely recommend that. Then hyperlinks is also an option, right? You could think of a micro frontends that are connected with hyperlinks. If you don't have to display them at the same time, if you have deep linking, that could be the simplest way of connecting them. Then something like packages, for example, npm might be very good, where you just publish your different micro frontends and people can consume them in the standard way. Plugins is more the idea of hot loading or dynamically loading certain plugins during runtime. Then you have web components as the standard to load different elements that are isolated. And last but not least, using different SPAs in just one page. We again looked at that and said, okay, we don't want to do iframes. I've not seen iframes in a mobile app. Hyperlinks is, I think, more for a website. Dynamically loading different plugins is not really what we need because we have to ship all the code. And yeah, using different SPAs with like a framework around it, we don't want to do. So we said, okay, what we really want to do is we want to go to a monorepository. We want to use packages, a standard for packages, and we also want to use web components. These are kind of our three targets to do the shift to do a more proper development in that area. So we started with the monorepository. We pretty much completed that. We might go further by introducing other services into the monorepository, but at the moment it's really like the front end is having this kind of mono approach, while the backend services are isolated in its own repository. Yeah, that's kind of finished, I would say. The next thing we want to do is packages and npm. The problem is that we are already offering at the moment a custom hook where you can introduce custom functionality through the app. The problem with that hook is it's not that bad, but it's custom. New developers have to learn it. It's like you have to go to this end file and you have to write that down, the plugin name, and then it will create this plugin module.ts file that will then be injected in the app and that. So it's quite complicated, and we want to do and offer a more standardized way. So the idea is to publish all the different features that we can isolate as an npm package, and then people can just consume the packages they need, and we can also consume that. And the nice thing is that works quite well with the monorepository. So like we as a development team, of course, don't want to consume an npm package that you are working on currently. So you can still work in the monorepository. You can actually change all the features, and you can still provide out of the monorepository then the packages for others. And then last but not least, and I think that's kind of so npm is what we are currently working on, also introducing tooling like NX Workspace to support kind of that approach. And what's up there for the future is web components. That's kind of where we want to be one day. I think at the moment the standard is not quite there yet, because if you include a framework multiple times, or if you use multiple web components with the same framework, you pretty much have to load the framework X times that you're using it. But otherwise, I think the concept behind it is quite sexy, actually, because you're not introducing another framework dependency. It's a standard. With Ionic 4, they actually started building all their components as web components. So we're actually already using that from a consumer perspective. And it's nice because components now don't interact unwillingly with each other, but on the other hand, it also makes things harder because now you have to really care about your whole styling and all that because you're running in this container. So that's kind of the point where we're going to go in the future. So to sum it up, Little Red Riding Hood was saved, actually. It was pretty close, and in the future, I think we will never leave the path again, and we pretty much will do what the mother told us. What did we learn, actually? Yeah, we saw what hell could look like. Yeah, we got developers frustrated while doing that, so we don't want to do that again. Don't blame the framework for everything, right? It wasn't really the framework's fault in this case. It was our choice of the architecture we made, and it was our choice of the components we tried to put together. We kind of misused what it was meant for. The other learning was that being modular doesn't mean many repositories. I've seen that in a lot of projects that you try to create many repositories because it has other advantages, but at the end of the day, it makes development complicated. The other thing is more Cordova plugins are not better, right? If you start using a lot of Cordova plugins, you might want to think about if you're doing the right thing here, because it will also get you in trouble once you want to really publish a web portal. Yeah, and I think the thing to be alarmed of is if that's pretty obvious after you look at it, is if you see too many native features, then it's also time to maybe reconsider it. But at the end of the day, I think the overall learning we had is that you can really change the way how you work and the architecture without throwing everything away. It's painful, but you can do it, and I think we are much more happy than we were about, I don't know, 10 months ago, and actually fun developing new features again. Yeah, that's the little fairy tale I wanted to tell. And I'm open for questions. Okay, the question was if I start on a greenfield, what technology I would use. So I think the one decision is if you have this goal of providing an app and a web portal, then you need to go with hybrid technology. Don't see that many other options. But the question is if that really happens and if it's really the best idea to do. I mean, for example, Airbnb moved away from that approach. I think they moved from React to native implementation, although they were sharing code between app and the website. I think it also depends on what skill you have in your company. If it's all web developers, you will have a hard time finding native developers. And I think there's still advantage of having one team one team working on one application in that sense, because I think there's a downside of having like an Android team and an iOS team. You will have maybe the same look and feel and the same features, but the app will, at the moment we can just hand the code around through all the teams and all the teams could work on it. So every developer can do it. If you have split the team into two sorts of people, then this I think makes it much more difficult. If I would start today with a greenfield project, I would probably look at something like Flutter, because I think that's quite appealing, especially the fact that it generates native code, but then at the end of the day, you can also work with native elements more easily in one environment. I think that's something I would try out, yeah. Any other questions? Yep. Yeah, so basically that was what our thought about half a year ago as well, right? It was too early, not that many developers using it yet. Basically, you never know with a framework like that published by Google, if they see it's not working, then they're just going to cancel that again. Actually, there was a talk this morning from the About You people that told that they are pretty much developing their new app in Flutter. They moved away from React Native to Flutter now. And they want to, I think, go live in November or something, or December, at least in Belgium. So I think as the general from a general coding perspective, it would work. I'm not sure about this native integration. I would probably not, bet on that yet. But I think that would be the part to check if you have something like a native SDK that you heavily want to leverage. Yeah. So the question was, you have the small sheet where you go to the dentist and they tick the boxes, and then you only have to pay half the price when you have problems with your teeth. You could just scan it. It's not. They won't digitize that at the moment, unfortunately. Yeah. The major challenge there is pretty much, I'm not sure who's insured with the Techniker Krankenkasse and has used their health features. And if you look into the invoices you get or the treatment they did to you, it's like half a year old at least. So the real challenge here is not really implementing that in the app. The real challenge there is getting data sooner and faster from the doctors to the insurance and from the insurance to the customer. Yeah. No, but it doesn't do that quite yet, unfortunately. Yep. Yeah, good question. So yes, we upgraded Ionic 3 to 4. We upgraded our Angular version, but we didn't try capacitor yet. We're kind of afraid, which is probably a bad guidance, but since our Cordova wrapper is quite big that we wrote on ourselves, that's something we would have to change with capacitor. And since that is the ugly part of our app, we didn't do that yet. And my feeling is also that at the moment, like you don't have all the plugins you have with Cordova already ported to capacitor. I think a lot of them are because you can just wrap it. Yeah, no, we haven't tried it yet. We will have to do that one day, I guess. Yeah. Did you?
It's actually 100% backward compatible, so you can use all the Cordova plugins.
Okay, can we trust the 100% or? Okay, that's good to know. I have not met that many people who did the switch. Okay, yeah. Did you go from Cordova 7 or 8 to capacitor or Cordova 9?
I don't know that.
Okay, no worries. Okay, I think then it's coffee time.